So with the previous short tutorial, I just set up the way that we'll get, let's start over again. So with the previous tutorial, I set up the component tangent curve. And we explained kind of what we're going to need and how we get there. If I go back to thinking about our 4 points and our edges of our component, we can see that this is associated to our Rhino geometry. So as I move any of these 4 points, our geometry is changing. Let's go step by step, because what we're going to need is a percentage along its length to get our kind of edges, as well as a couple of diagonals as a way to work with this. So we're going to do this with evaluate curve, and we're just going to work kind of step by step through these to build this up. And so we can see we've got our 4 curves, and maybe what I'll do is move this down, because we're gonna do everything 4 or 8 times depending on what we're needing to do. So let's start with our diagonals. And the way that I want to do that is maybe each line I want to get, let's see if I need 4 or 8. So what I want to do is I want to get a diagonal running in this direction. So I'm going to need a point from here, and a point here, a point here, and a point here, and a point here, 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 and here. So I'm going to need 8 points evaluated based on these 4 curves. So let's get an evaluate curve. And we'll create a number of these. We know that we're going to have to parameterize the curve, so before I copy them, I might as well include that. If let's see, maybe I'll make 2 of these. Let's make a slider. This slider we want on the low side, but let's call it between 0.1 is less than 0.8. So this will give us that range. Maybe I'll just increase this to be 0.10 to 0.80. Oh, I just screwed that up. I'll make a new slider. From 0.10 is less than 0.80. So this gives us 2 decimal places to work within this. And so let's start with these. And so this will be our parameter. Let's copy this 4 times. And let's plug in our 4 curves. And so now as we move our slider, we can see these moving along that length. And the reason why I only did 4 is that I want to have the other portion kind of move into it. And so maybe even then, I don't actually want 0.8 because I don't want these to cross. I want to set this to be 0.50. So I can go from 0.1 to basically the middle. And actually, maybe I don't even want it to approach the middle. Let's set this to be 0.40. And so the way that I would think about this then is that I want the corresponding point to be mirrored along the length. And the way that I'm going to do that, because I've reparameterized the curves, I know that this can be a subset of 1. So what I mean by that is what I want to do is I want to use a subtraction tool or a subtraction component, and I want to start with 1, and then I want to subtract my previous element, which will then result in 1 minus whatever I have here. So let's copy our evaluate curve components and replace these 4 new ones with our parameter of the 1 minus. And what should result when I do this is that when I change the slider, all 8 are changing, but we can see them moving along that outside edge. So that's looking good for us. Let's basically do this, copy all of this again, and copy these. Oh, again, I was holding down cap lock instead of shift. And if I copy all of these, maybe move these up, copy and paste, and move these down, what we'll get is now another set of curves that move in here. And so the reason why I did that is let's work through both a diagonal, like we need some edges, and we also need some diagonals. So let's begin to locate those. We'll do this with a line with a start and an end point. So let's just see if we can find these points. And maybe it doesn't matter where we kind of start, but let's start here with a diagonal. This will be one of our start points. This means that our other corresponding diagonal point here is here. So let's see if we can find that one. As we click through, here it is. And that's our end point. So now let's look for this point. Well, and maybe I'll just be a little more careful as I look for these. So of course it's the last point there. We'll set this to be our start point. And this means that we want this to be our end point. So let's find that. It's process by elimination. It gets a little bit easier. So now we have those two diagonals. Let's look in the other direction, which comes across here. As often the case on Saturday at 1 o'clock, I'm working on a tutorial. That's a tornado test siren that we hear outside. So let's start here with this one as we move across to our other one here. We have that diagonal. And then the last one should be easy as a process of elimination, which should be start and our end point. So now we have these 4 lines. And remember, as we think about the Hauer screen, we have the diagonals, and then we're also going to have the edges. So the nice thing about the sliders is that we can continue to change them and make sure that everything that we're doing is associated. I'm going to set these to be a little wider. Now let me set the others to be a little closer to the edge. And let's take a look at this. We're going to make a set of lines. But this time around, we're going to the last one that I need. We're going to set these to be along the edge, right? Because we want to make something that goes from here to the edge to the edge. And so we have to capture our edges along here. So let's look for our next one, which is here. Find this point. So now we have 2. Where's this point? So let's start here, and then here. So we have that edge. And then I think we just need one more. Yep, that's right. Which will go from this point to this point. So now with these we have 4 lines and 4 lines. it can be helpful. I'm going to group these together. I'll group these together. So now given these, let's find the midpoint from each of these lines. That's easy enough to do, but again, we could use it with the middle, curve middle, which would just find the midpoint for us. But what we actually are also going to need to do our tangency curve is the tangency of the curve that we're getting. So let's use our evaluate curve again. And we're going to create an evaluate curve for all of these. And let's reparameterize, and then let's set this to be, we know we want the midpoint, so I'm just going to do this as a panel, as 0.5. That will be for all of them. And so now as I copy this, copy this, we'll be able to get the midpoint for all of these. We can even group these together and group those together. So now we have a kind of clear way of working with them. We'll pull these over as well. So now let's plug in these curves. Now we're getting our midpoint. And again, remember, this is flat. But it's a proof of concept. And I just want to continue to, as you're building your own design, you have to be able to test this and make sure that things are working along the way. So again, let's come back and look how this is moving. It's a little weird through the middle where our midpoints aren't really corresponding, but I think it's also because of how maybe extreme it's moving out of square. But let's say that that's okay for now. And let's build a couple of our evaluate curves to make sure that this is working the way that we want it to. So what does it look like? We're going to want to go from this point to this point to this point, right? And that will become an evaluate curve, and we'll work through with all four of them. So I do have the evaluate curve over to the side. We have the tangents, we have the vertices, we have that. Let's leave the slider that will relate to all of these. So we're going to need 4 of these. And let's find the ones that we need. So let's see, from here, it's going to kind of work like that. So if this is our first one, I don't think we want this to be our first curve. Let's find this point, and this one. So we know that that's at the top. So let's start with this one. So we know this is our first vertex and our first tangent. We know that this is our second. I'll hold down Shift, and our second tangent. And then we want our third one, which is over here, which is this one. Holding down Shift, and we'll add the tangency. We've got to flip both of our outside edges because we want them coming from here and back. So these are these 2 points, and we know that we can just reverse the vector. And all we're reversing is the tangency. So as we come out of here, come out of here, we'll replace this one. And we'll subtract this one out by holding down Control, and then we'll add this one back in. Okay, so one thing that happened in managing these as they come in, what we're going to want to do is just maybe have a little more control as we go forward with this. And so the way that I would build that control, because what happened is that now it's getting confused about which vertex and which tangent. It's using a tangent from one of the others as it ties into that. So let's, we've got a couple of ways to bring these together. Merge for me recently hasn't been working as precisely as I expect it to. And so let's see, what have I, let's use weave. So weave gives us a little bit more control in that we can set a pattern. And so we're going to want to bring in 3 streams, and our pattern, which we'll set consistently, we'll do this with a panel and make it a multi-line data. And we'll just say 0, 1, 2. That's going to be our pattern. And let's set one for our points and for our tangents. And so for our first one, our first point is here. Our second point is here. And our third point. And now let's do the same with the tangents, and that our tangent is the first one, the tangent is the second one, and then this tangent is the third one. And I just screwed that up at the bottom by not pulling the vectors. That's the first one, that's the second one. So what it should do is weave these in for the vertex and for the tangent. So now we can see we get that tangency as it moves between these 3. And now let's look at, did we do it correctly? I think so. So let's find our next set. We can just maybe correlate these a little bit. So I'll grab another set of weaves. And maybe let's just disconnect these. Well, maybe it's easier just to make new clean weaves. Let's plug in the pattern. Let's add a third stream. And then we know we're going to need 6 or 5 more of these for each of them. And while it feels like an extra, maybe it feels like a lot, this is certainly going to give us a level of control that we're going to need if we need to swap these out, if we need to change their tangency, if we need to do anything like that. So our next set is going to be from our first point here to our second point to our third point. And so let's use that as our point and our tangency. And again, remember our tangency might flip, it might not. We'll work with that. And I just realized that I plugged that into where I want the point, but tangency and here. So our next one is this point. So this will be our middle point and our middle tangency. And then we're looking for this point here, which is this one, which will be our third point, and our third tangency, and we'll plug these two into the vertices and the tangents. Those are all sorts of screwy. It looks like the first one is right. The second one and third one need to flip. So this is where it gets a little bit easier having used the weave. First one's fine. This one will want to flip the tangency. So we'll reverse the vector. Tangency. This is the third tangency. So that got fixed, and now we'll just have to find the middle one, which is here, and we'll reverse this tangency. For there. And so we can see it's getting a little tight in terms of what's happening with where that midpoint is. If we change our underlying points, it's a little less extreme. If we change, we can always reduce some of our tangency with these, and at least they're meeting up at the point, and we can just work through our other remaining two. And so now we'll have a proof of concept as we get this, where all four makes this continuous arc. We can hide some of these things, and we'll see what it looks like, if it's appropriate, as we get to our final element. So here's the point that we'll start with for our next one. Point and tangency. The midpoint that we're looking at is here. So it gets a little easier as we go. Did I just do the same thing again? I did. So this tangency is the first one. This is our point. Tangency, and then our third point is here. Point and tangency. Let's plug these in. I'm sure we'll have to flip some things around. So our midpoint is fine, our last point is fine, it's just the tangency of our first one, which is here. We've already got a flipped tangency, so it's our first tangency that plugs in there. So that looks good. Now let's do our last one. Should be a little easier. So this will be our first point, our first tangency, our middle point. Again, it's the last midpoint that we needed. And let's see, this was our first point, here's our last point. Plug these two in, and then those worked. So now we've got our continuous curve. We can hide probably a whole bunch of these things now. We can hide those points. Hide those points. We can hide those. All of our edge points as well. And so now we've got just that continuous line that we see. And again, this is flat. So we're going to have to look at how we add some thickness to this. But now we see we can also begin to change how far this is from the edge. When it gets a little extreme, it starts to break down, and also how thick our elements are through the middle. But we're getting that continuous, four-part continuous. What now looks to be a continuous curve all the way through is because we've used the tangent curve, and we're getting tangency at that point in the right vector so that those match up perfectly. If we change our points, this continues to work. right? And it's because we've also used a kind of proportional set of relationships between them, because we're using those edges and we're starting to break it down into midpoints and percentages along its length. And so all of that's looking good, and this is a nice place for us to stop. And you can take a break, or you can pick up with the next one soon.